It is believed that this year's theme, acceleration of the African Continental Free Trade Area implementation, adopted by the African Union at the last week's 36th ordinary session of the Assembly of the Union, will lift 30 million people out of extreme poverty and 68 million people from moderate poverty. This comes at a time when almost 20% of Africa's population faces chronic hunger and much of its young citizenry remains unemployed. Political researcher Cynthia Chigwenya joins me in studio for more. Cynthia, thanks so much for coming on to the show. Now, a week ago, you attended the summit. What are some of the key highlights that you picked up?
Thank you so much for having me today, Hugo. And I think congratulations on the program that you're having, which really spotlights the work of African leaders and young African leaders across the continent. I think the highlights from the 36th session of the African Union Assembly was firstly, for the first time ever, they had a youth town hall, which actually focused on the work that young people in the continent are doing. But not only that, as you highlighted, that this year is the year of accelerating the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and some of the prospects it holds in enhancing trade and boosting direct investment on the continent. So I think that will be one of the key issues we're looking at as the year progresses, and how that will have an impact on inequalities which are exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, the new chair is President Azali Assoumani of the Union of Comoros, who's taken over the chairmanship of the AU. Now, his country is one of the smallest and one of the poorest on the continent. How much value do you think he'll add to the African Union? How much influence is he likely to have?
Great. That's a very interesting question that you raised there. And I think many of the people on the continent as well are wondering in terms of capacities and capabilities. But I'm going to share with you, I'm not too sure if it's a proverb or a saying that says, if we judge every animal by its ability to climb a tree, then we're being unfair in our apparatus. Is the Union of Comoros a relatively smaller state in terms of economic capability and other things? Of course it is, but does it mean that it cannot lead? And even if it might show some shortcomings, as other people are anticipating, I think it also provides room for more coordination among member states of the African Union and having countries work together, which is really what the AFCTA promotes, which is working together.
Well, we do know that William Ruto or Kenya were meant to take over the chairmanship and gladly passed it on to President Assoumani. But moving away from that, I suppose the other side of the coin would suggest that because he's coming from one of Africa's poorest countries, he's likely to highlight the challenges that the poorer nations on the continent are having, as opposed to a more successful economy.
I'm not sure if that was a statement, but if I get that you think that the focus that the Union of Comoros will
I'm saying that is that a possibility, that because he's coming from the poorer countries, that the issues that he's likely to highlight will be a lot different, for instance, if, say, a country like South Africa or a much stronger economy was in charge of the AU?
The AU. I think countries are prone to highlight issues that are not only of national interest, but also of continental interest. And I think what is peculiar about the Union of Comoros is its diversity, and it's made up of a number of indigenous groups. So we could also think of it in terms of highlighting the rights of indigenous groups. But not only that, we can look at issues such as the blue economy and how that is actually relevant not only to states that are ocean states, but also even the so-called landlocked states, because this is something that is relevant to all nations. So I would not limit it to that, but I think that's some of the sort of the peculiarities that they bring to the table that may not be common to other countries across the continent.
Well, Africa is home to 400 million of the world's youngest people, between 15 to 35 years of age. Just how much does the Africa Free Continental Trade area allow young people to participate?
I'll go back to the example I gave at the beginning of this interview, which is the very first youth town hall. We actually had the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the Secretariat, His Excellency Wamkele is speaking to over 200 young people that gathered at the African Union for the first time on the sidelines of the Heads of State Summit. So I think that's evident of the incremental change that we see within the African Union as an institution, but also reflective of some of the changes we see on the specific countries themselves. So in that regard, I think because the African Union is an assembly of different states, and once we see that continental prioritization of young people's participation, then we hope that throughout the year it will be mirrored across different countries and across different states.
Well, you talk about participation. Young people represent almost 30%, if not a little bit more, of the continent's population, at least that age group. Do you have a seat, or should you be pushing for a seat on the AU to look after the agendas of young people, do you think?
We do have a seat at the AU, and we've got the Office of the African Union's Youth Envoy, who champions various issues on the African continent. And during the previous year, she actually did listening tours where she visited over 20 countries and had sit-downs with young people and then reported back to the African Union. And in addition to that, we've got my office, which is the Office of the African Youth Ambassadors for Peace, and one is appointed per region to represent the 5 regions we have in the continent. So I think that's progress that has been made, and the onus is on us as young people to leverage in these institutional changes we're seeing to bring about more representation of young people. And I'm going to admit it, of course, in relation to the number of young people we have on the continent, we've got millions and millions of them. And I don't think it's practicable to absorb everybody into the African Union as an institution. But those that have been given the mandate and those that have got the capacities, including myself, have got the responsibility to ensure that they represent young people to the best of their capabilities.
Now, when we take a look at the leadership of Africa, I mean, we're looking at Nigeria, for instance, where the 3 front runners, 2 are in their mid-70s, and the younger of the 3 front runners is 61. How likely are the elderly in politics, if you will, to represent the issues of young people on the one hand, and on the other hand, young people have a tremendous voice. Are they using enough of their voice to push for change, peaceful change, in their respective territories? And if not, what needs to be done?
Great. When it comes to participation in electoral processes, I think it's more complex than just a matter of representation. Politics, as one of my colleagues at work say, politics requires financing. So it's not just a matter of young people getting into politics, having the wherewithal to participate and to do a campaign, for instance. So when you speak about young people's representation, we also need to extend it further to, okay, are there means through which young people can finance themselves if they want to run a political campaign, for instance, if they want to run a training for other young people. And then in terms of Nigeria, I think Nigeria provides a really substantial case for young people on the continent. They had not too long ago the Not Too Young to Run bill, which so the reduction of the number of years that are required to run for political office. And we've seen more recently with the protests that they had. So I think we've seen so many changes that have signified that young people in Nigeria are capable, and in spaces where they're not given the sort of invited space to participate, they've created alternative methods such as participating on various social media platforms to air out their cause. And I think that signifies some bit of change, and perhaps it's being a young person, I'm quite hopeful that the continent is going towards a more representative, is becoming more representative in terms of politics and governance.
Now, coming back to the African Free Trade area, and certainly what it has to offer, you know, we take a look at some of the most marginalized groups on the continent or across the world. Women fall in that category, as do young people. Rwanda, on the other hand, 74% of those engaged in cross-border trade, which speaks largely to free trade areas and agreements, are women. What key learnings can we draw from what Rwanda has done, or certainly what the women in Rwanda are doing?
Great. I like the fact that you bring up Rwanda, because I think it is quite if we term it an economic miracle. But also Rwanda comes from a context where it had a genocide in 1994, and I was privileged to be one of the people that actually worked in Kigali some years ago. So I think what we see from Rwanda is the issue of intentional and ethical leadership. When there are structures in place that allow for inclusivity and more promotion of participation, not just of women, youth in politics, and it creates more engagement. But I also think that Rwanda's case is peculiar, and I'll say this again because of the country's history. There is a commitment towards post-conflict reconstruction. There is a commitment towards building together because people have experienced the impacts of war and genocide. And some of the countries may not be privy to such experiences, or they may not have similar objectives because their generations did not have the same. So those are some of the differences we see between Rwanda and
So you're suggesting
other
that
contexts.
Rwanda's advantage, if you will, is the fact that they went through such a horrific period in their history, and that other countries that didn't, because they didn't have a horrific experience, shouldn't be as forward-thinking as them.
I wouldn't suggest that, but my line of thought here is experience changes people. So a South African context cannot be extracted and placed on Zimbabwe, specifically because the two contexts are different. Of course, there are other issues that are related, but I wouldn't necessarily suggest or imply that there could be a one-size-fits-all for economic development or for development in general.
So is it fair to say that there's obviously a lot more political will in Rwanda than there is in most countries on the African continent want to liberate women, liberate young people, if you will, afford them the opportunity to get involved in business and assist in growing their respective economies?
Political will is a muscle, so I would say perhaps the political will is more exercised in Rwanda. Does it mean it's absent in other contexts? It is. It just needs the right impetus to push. And one of the ways through which this can be done is actually having informed citizenry that demands accountability and that demands their politicians to be more intentional about inclusivity or to put in place certain policies that are beneficial to the people.
Now, final thoughts, just transition to clean energy. We know that Mr. Guterres acknowledged that transition to clean energy was a necessary part of what many countries have to do. Unfortunately, what it does is it makes it extremely difficult for Africa in that there isn't sufficient financial resource provided by the West to make this happen. If we take a look at South Africa, for instance, it needs something in the region, I think, of $8.5 billion, right? Less than 100 million has been provided by the West towards the just energy transition. Your thoughts?
Two things from there. Just transition, I think it's fair to acknowledge that Antonio Guterres, during his speech, which was issued to the African Union, acknowledged the need to have a just transition. But in light of the different realities that we've had on the continent, it's also one of the issues we need to look at in terms of, okay, this is a topic on the international agenda, on the global scale, but when we come back to the varied African context, how is it translating at the national level? South Africa at this point has got an energy crisis. And do we still promote a just transition? Do we look at the resources that South Africa has? And if we do this, how do we balance the two? But not only that, I also think that that the discussion around the just transition should not only look at the investment from the West. What are we doing, homegrown solutions, to ensure that when some of these investments are not coming through, the projects that were started in terms of sustainable energies are actually long-term and can be sustained on the continent in the event that some of the external challenges to foreign investment are not met or are not seen through.
Cynthia, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming on to Africa Today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Cynthia Chigwenya, political researcher. Appreciate your time.